Two most popular scary horror stories tailing. Let's Sare. My parents had built their dream house in a new subdivision at the time. They had chosen a lot that did not have any neighbors yet, and the history of the place was still unknown. I remember the first day we moved into the home, something about it felt off, specifically my and my sister's room. Our rooms were the corner rooms on the second flood, and we shared a balcony. My parents had also built a small nook space next to the windows where it was long and wide enough for you to either sit or lay in. On our first night there, I had fallen asleep on my phone and had been sleeping on the mattress on the floor since there was no bed frame yet. I was a light sleeper, so despite being asleep, I could feel like something was at my feet, as if someone was holding my ankles down. I was able to sleep through the night, but the feeling never went away, even after a few days had passed. Terrified, I convinced my sister to let me sleep with her in her room the following night. Her bed was positioned next to the wall, and I had moved my mattress next to her with my back facing the window. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up, and that feeling started to creep in again. I wanted to shake the feeling off and needed confirmation that it was nothing. So I took a peek, and all I could see was what seemed like a dark figure standing in front of our window. Alarm bells were going off because our rooms were on the second floor, and there was no one else upstairs since my parents' rooms were downstairs. A few seconds later, I could hear the tapping on the window, but refused to look back. I had tried to quietly wake my sister up, but she only shifted her position and turned to the wall instead. I was too scared to get up because of the terror I felt. Instead, I inched closer to my sister and turned my back, faking being asleep despite hearing the taps. In the following nights to come, cousins or friends who would visit at our house would report hearing a woman crying, and the same tapping noise I would hear whenever they slept in a room upstairs. Our rooms were often used as guest rooms, and if they were both occupied, we would sleep with my parents. My parents often laughed or shrugged it off because they didn't believe in the paranormal or the afterlife at that. One day, while talking to the guard on duty on our way to the jogging path, my mom had mentioned we were new in the area and where we resided. By the reaction of the guard, we could tell he was familiar with where we had chosen to live. We were told that before the area was made, a subdivision, there were houses in the area, but just like now, the house built on our property had been an isolated house. A mom, her husband, and 3-year-old daughter had lived in the house. The house had caught on fire in the first floor and was on its way up when the family had awoke to the smoke. Their daughter was sleeping in what is now my sister's room, while the wife and husband had slept in what was now my room. Their room door had melted shut, and the mom had used the balcony door to gain access to her 3-year-old's bedroom, but it had also been melted shut. She was attempting to save her daughter, but when she realized she couldn't open the door, she started banging on the window in the hopes to wake her up. Despite her husband's attempt to get himself and her out of the house, she refused to leave, trapping all 3 of them in the fire, which resulted in all 3 of them passing away. I couldn't help but think if the shadow, tapping on the window, and the sound of a woman crying was the same woman that had died in the house who had desperately tried to save her baby but failed. That night, as I tried to sleep, I could envision the mom wailing in front of the window frame as she's banging on the glass, and these noises slowly fading to taps and weakened cries as the fires consumed her and her family. Story 2, The Woman by the River. The year was 1998. I was only a few months old. My mother and father were driving us from Dallas to see my grandmother from my father's side, who lived in Fredericksburg, Texas. My brother Emmanuel and 2 older sisters, Elizabeth and Isabella, were asleep in the back, and I was in the middle seat in my baby seat. It was around a 4-hour and 30-minute drive, so by the time we hit the 3-hour mark, we were in the middle of nowhere. Everyone else but my mother and father was asleep. There were no stores, gas stations, houses, and there were just mountains in the far distance, so it was completely dark. The only light other than the headlights were the stars that stretched across the sky, and the moon was full. and from time to time, we came across full, bright, reflective road signs and freeway lights. There were no other vehicles at this time at night since it was around 3 in the morning. They continued to drive. My mother noticed something at the corner of her eye, and when she looked, she saw a person in the dark. Then she told my father, "Hey, look, there's a woman out there." My dad looked over and saw what my mother was seeing. He also saw the woman, but then my mother noticed that this woman was very tall, like way taller than a normal person, almost about 11 to 12 feet tall, and her face was disfigured and pale. Her eyes were extremely dark, almost like she had no eyes. She seemed to be wearing a green dress like the Virgin Mary, almost like she was trying to look like her, but Mother went cold with fear as she realized that this thing was not human, let alone a beautiful, innocent woman like the Virgin Mary. "Drive the fucking car!" my mother screamed as she started to panic. My father looked at the woman and said, "She might be asking for a ride." My mother then yelled at him, "That is not a human being. Don't you see that thing is nothing normal, it's pure evil, es la cosa mala." She screamed. In English, la cosa mala means the evil thing. The car started to back off, almost like a giant magnet was pulling it. Then my father started to step on the gas pedal and said, "The car won't start," my father yelled as the car started to sound like it was about to shut off. The woman was standing perfectly still, and her hand was raised in the asking for a lift pose and did not move a single muscle. She was tilting her head to the side like a dog. My mother then stepped on my father's foot on the brake. The car started, and they drove away, doing. "Almost 70. Whatever you do, do not look back," my mother demanded as my father continued to drive. My mother only looked back to see us still sound asleep, unaware of the horror that we just witnessed. We continued until we came across a bridge that was about 5 minutes away from Fredericksburg. My dad stopped the car on the bridge so my mom could pee by the edge. There was no sound at all. She could not hear any crickets. Even the water under the bridge was silent. When she finished, she got in the car, and they drove into town to my grandmother's house. When we got inside, my mother told my grandmother about what happened. She put her hand over her mouth and agreed that whatever that thing was, it was pure evil, or, as many Mexicans would say, la cosa mala. What is even more frightening, my mother could feel like we were being followed the whole way, almost like this thing was flying behind us or over us. What makes this even more terrifying is that my mother heard the La Llorona the night before at our apartment. We were all asleep. I was in the room with my brother Emmanuel and my father and mother. My mom woke up as she felt something strange. Then she heard the horrifying scream outside the apartment hallway. The scream traveled from the stairs passing our apartment through the complex until it faded away. My mother then got up and walked to the living room and saw my older brothers and sisters asleep. My brothers were on the couches and my sisters on the floor. She then saw the front door opened, but the door chain was holding it in place. She then opened the door and peeked outside to see that it was completely silent and there was not a single person outside. As she walked down the hall, she looked around and then looked down the parking lot and saw no one. When she reached the laundromat down the hall, she saw no one in there, even with the lights on. She then walked back to the apartment, closed the door, locked it again to make sure, and put the door chain back on. The next day, she asked my father if he heard anything, and he said no. Then she asked the family friend Santiago, who was awake, drinking and watching TV, but he also did not hear a thing. For years, my mother has told us this story many times, and it has scared the hell out of everyone who heard it. I do not know if the woman they saw out in the middle of nowhere was the same thing it might have been following us, or maybe we were just unlucky to run into two separate evil entities.